The Leak Mound Interpretive Trail is sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration, the Georgia Department of Transportation, and the University of West Georgia.
Hi, and welcome to another Leak Mounds Interpretive Trail podcast. If you're following along on the trail, this podcast corresponds to the Past, Enjoy, Don't Destroy panel. I'm Marcus Toft.
And I'm Jennifer Teeter. So Marcus, when I was researching this podcast, I was looking at the laws that protect archaeological sites, and I came across a lot of looting cases. I didn't realize what danger archaeological sites can be in sometimes.
Yeah, I think that people don't realize that, if they're out at a site and they happen to pick up artifacts that are left behind, that there's anything wrong with that. But it really does a lot of damage, not only to the site, but to what we can learn from that site. And people don't know that there are laws that protect against that.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how much we need these laws to really protect archaeological sites. Barbara Paul from the National Trust for Historic Preservation says it's like burning down the library before you have a chance to read the books in it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy too, because there's so much information that these sites hold, but as soon as you remove the objects, even just one object, you lose so much information. Because what archaeologists are looking for aren't just the objects themselves, but how they relate to the whole site and the other objects that are at that location.
Yeah, and looting, if somebody steals the artifact from the site, it takes it out of the context, but also as they dig through and move things around, it changes the location and context that artifacts are in.
Right. And a lot of it, you can just think of it as, even if you weren't disturbing the site, you're still a lot of times on property that doesn't belong to you, which just alone is against the law.
Yeah, a lot of the laws really deal with permission, and if it's private property, you need permission from the landowner, and if it's public property, you need permission from state and federal governments, depending on who owns the land.
Right. I mean, the key thing is you can't just start digging wherever you want. Even if it's a place where maybe you're not disturbing an actual archaeological site, if you don't own the property, you still need to find out who does and get permission to dig there.
Exactly, and criminal trespass charges really go hand in hand with looting charges. Like, I'm looking at a case from Burke County, Georgia, where 4 men were charged with criminal trespass, digging on an archaeological site without permission, and littering.
Littering, huh?
Yeah, ironically, they were charged with littering while they were looting a shell bin, which, as we'll talk about in another podcast, is a trash heap.
So, Jennifer, what kind of sentencing can people expect if they get charged with looting?
Well, it can vary, and sometimes it can be pretty harsh. The 4 guys in Burke County, they had $1,000 fines for each count, a minimum of $7,300 fine to repair the archaeological site and physical damage to the site, 12 weekends in jail, community service, 3 years of probation, and a ban on attending any type of artifact show.
And the artifact show they must have been selling these artifacts illegally?
They might have. I'm not sure what they were going to do with the artifacts once they found them, but they aren't allowed to go to artifact shows now.
Well, we might laugh, but selling artifacts is a pretty serious problem, and a lot of times it's the motivation behind people looting archaeological sites. There's one case where 24 people were charged with not only looting but also selling artifacts, and this was a huge case. It was done by federal authorities, and it spanned about 4 states, and these people are going to face some serious penalties.
Yeah, and all of the people that were charged weren't even actively looting. They were just involved with selling these stolen artifacts.
Yeah, some of the people were the people that looted, like you said, and others were the buyers or the sellers of the artifacts.
Yeah, it sounds like officials are really serious about cracking down on looting and protecting these archaeological sites.
Well, Jennifer, a great example of how serious officials are is a 2004 case from Reno, Nevada, where an Oregon man was charged $2.5 million fine for looting an American Indian cave in Nevada.
Wow.
Yeah, and $2.5 million is a lot, and that's only the 4th largest ever fine assessed for an archaeological theft.
Yeah, and this was a really severe case of looting. I think they recovered more than 2,000 artifacts, and that includes a 10,000-year-old pair of sandals, which could be possibly the oldest footwear found on Earth.
Yeah, and Pat Barker, who's an archaeologist with the Bureau of Land Management, has this quote where he says, "There's no way to reconstruct the history of the site thanks to what he did. It's a loss for everybody." And that's one of the reasons that these sites need to be protected, is because it is a loss for everybody, and there is no way to reconstruct the history once it's been altered like that.
Yeah, I think that really shows how archaeological sites are a non-renewable resource.
Which is why it's really important that archaeologists excavate sites, because they have training in using the proper techniques and methods.
Yeah, and not just techniques and methods, but they also meticulously document everything that they excavate, whereas looters don't. As we could see in the first case we talked about, there was just massive damage to the site, and all of the artifacts and objects were just out of context, so we don't know what their true meaning was.
Right. And archaeologists aren't looking for the objects or the artifacts in and of themselves. They're, as you mentioned, recording where they find them, and they're trying to find answers to questions about the people who lived in a certain place.
Exactly. And I think before we end this podcast, we should really summarize what constitutes looting and what our listeners should avoid when they're at archaeological sites.
Each state will have its own laws that protect against looting, but in general, we can define it as digging, disturbing, surface collecting, or harming any archaeological site without permission.
On private property, you need the permission from the landowner, and on public property, you need permission from state or federal organizations, depending on who owns the land. And in Georgia, you generally need permission from the Department of Natural Resources.
Yeah.
And if you're not sure what constitutes public property, state parks, historic sites, wildlife management and recreation areas, state forests, state highway rights-of-way, navigable rivers and stream bottoms, and up to 3 miles off the coast are all included in public property.
Yeah, so if you plan on digging, metal detecting, or surface collecting on any of those types of property, you need to contact the DNR. And Jennifer, the Council on American Indian Concerns has a great brochure called Artifact Collecting and the Law in Georgia, What's Legal and What's Not. And I'd like to end this podcast with just a short summary that they have about why these various laws exist. And it says that there are 3 fundamental principles that guide all state and federal laws that deal with human remains, artifacts, archaeological sites, and collecting. And the first principle is respect for the religious beliefs of all Americans, including American Indians. The second principle is respect for the dead. And the third is the protection of archaeological sites for the benefit of all Americans, not just a few, because these sites are part of our common heritage.
I think that's a really good point. It just shows how we should have respect for each other in the past.
Right.
And if you'd like to learn more about the Council on American Indian Concerns, you can visit their website at www.ganet.org/INDcouncil.
Well, thanks for listening to this Leek Mounds Interpretive Trail podcast.
The Leek Mounds Interpretive Trail project was done in partnership with the City of Cartersville and Bartow County. Music by Tommy Wildcat.